on the remarkable journey that our unique family of free and independent nations has made since 1949.
The king collapsed when he saw the DNA results. What they revealed will shake the monarchy to its core. A secret affair, a hidden son, 50 years of lies exposed by science. Palace insiders tried to bury this, but the truth always surfaces. When father and son finally met face to face, what happened next left everyone speechless.
We cannot help but think of those for whom the devastating effects of conflict.
The envelope arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, but what it contained was anything but ordinary. It didn't come through the usual palace channels, the ones monitored and logged by countless staff members before reaching the king's desk. Instead, it was hand-delivered by a man who had spent nearly 4 decades serving the royal household in silence. Dr. Ashworth had been a palace physician for 37 years, a geneticist who had treated 3 generations of royals and kept every secret he'd been asked to keep, until now. The king had been awake since 4 in the morning. Insomnia has become a familiar companion since taking the throne, a side effect of the weight that comes with the crown. He stood by the window of his private study, watching dawn break over the ancient castle grounds when the knock came. Even in private moments like these, formality never quite left him. It was ingrained too deeply, a product of decades of training in how a monarch should behave. Dr. Ashworth entered the room looking noticeably different from their last meeting. His face had grown gaunt, and he carried himself with the unmistakable burden of someone about to share information that would change everything. In his hands was a sealed envelope, and in his eyes was something the king had rarely seen in palace staff: genuine fear about what came next. What the physician was about to reveal had no protocol attached to it. There was no handbook for this situation, no centuries of royal precedent to guide them. The tests had been conducted 4 times, Dr. Ashworth explained, his voice unsteady. 4 separate laboratories, different technicians each time, using blind study methods to prevent any possibility of contamination or bias. The science was absolute. The probability calculations left no room for doubt, and the implications were impossible to comprehend. The tests involved DNA samples that had been taken in 1997, part of routine medical documentation for the royal family. These samples were standard procedure, carefully preserved in climate-controlled vaults beneath London as part of the comprehensive medical records kept for every member of the royal household. When Dr. Ashworth had run comparative analysis against more recent samples, something unexpected appeared in the data. He ran the tests again, certain there must be an error, then again, and again. Each time, the results were identical. The king took the envelope with hands that betrayed his inner turmoil, despite his composed exterior. Inside were pages of scientific data, genetic markers, probability percentages rendered in cold clinical language. This wasn't speculation or rumor. This was a documented fact. Somewhere in London, a man was going about his ordinary life, completely unaware that his entire understanding of himself was about to be rewritten. The affair had taken place in 1973. The king, then just 24 years old, had met a woman at a country estate gathering. She was from minor aristocracy, the kind of beauty and intelligence that made young men act foolishly. He was drowning in the expectations that came with being heir to the throne, desperate for something genuine in a life that felt increasingly choreographed. Their relationship lasted 4 months. It was passionate and reckless, everything a future king couldn't afford to be. When palace officials became aware of the liaison, they intervened quickly. They understood the danger such a relationship posed to the careful path being laid out for the young heir's future. The affair ended, encouraged by those whose job it was to protect the institution above all else. The woman disappeared from court circles shortly after. She married a diplomat, moved to Geneva, and built a quiet life, far from the scrutiny of the British press. In 1974, she had a son. She told everyone, including the boy himself, that her diplomat husband was the father. There was no reason for anyone to question this. The timeline was plausible, and the woman had moved on with her life. She had been lying for 51 years. The son grew up to become an architect. He built a successful career designing embassies and museums, buildings meant to last beyond his lifetime. He married, had 3 children of his own, and lived the kind of unremarkable yet accomplished life that attracts no particular attention. He had never questioned his parentage because why would he? His childhood had been stable, his father figured decent if somewhat distant. There were no obvious gaps in the story he'd been told about his origins. Everything changed when his mother died the previous year. Among her personal effects, solicitors discovered a sealed letter with explicit instructions that it should only be opened after her death. Inside, she had written the truth. She named the heir, explained the affair, detailed the pregnancy, and described her decision to hide it all. She wrote about the unbearable burden of watching her son grow up with his biological father's mannerisms and features, never being able to speak the truth. The architect didn't believe it at first. He dismissed it as the confused memories of a dying woman, perhaps medications affecting her clarity in her final days. But his wife convinced him to take a DNA test, if only to settle the matter definitively and put it to rest. They expected the test to disprove his mother's claims. Instead, it confirmed them. That's when the architect made the call that eventually reached Dr. Ashworth. As a former palace physician with the necessary clearances and access to the royal family's ensigns, medical records, Dr. Ashworth was uniquely positioned to conduct the verification testing needed. He did so with scientific rigor, understanding the magnitude of what a positive result would mean. Now, in the king's private study, the two men stood surrounded by proof that couldn't be disputed. The genetic markers were clear. The probability was 99.97%. Those numbers left no room for doubt or alternative explanations. The king had a son he'd never known existed, a 51-year-old man who had lived an entire life completely outside the royal sphere. The king asked whether the architect knew whether any contact had been made beyond the initial DNA verification. Dr. Ashworth confirmed that only the laboratory staff knew, all of them bound by strict confidentiality agreements. But the man would want answers eventually. That much was certain. He deserved answers. Standing there with pages of scientific evidence in his hands, the king wasn't a monarch at that moment. He was a father who had never known his child existed. A man who had built his entire life on duty and sacrifice, only to discover that his actions had created another person's life entirely, someone who had grown up without him. He thought about his legitimate sons, how intimately he knew them despite all the pressures and complications of royal life. And now there was another son, a stranger who shared his DNA. The rain continued outside, steady and indifferent. The castle had stood for 900 years, witnessing countless royal dramas within its walls. But inside that study, everything had fundamentally shifted. The carefully constructed narrative of a lifetime had been shattered by science and a mother's deathbed confession. 50 years of absence stretched between the king and this unknown son. 50 years of birthdays, uncelebrated, milestones unwitnessed, a relationship that should have existed but never had the chance. By evening, 4 people knew the truth: the king, Dr. Ashworth, the private secretary, and the queen consort. Secrets in the modern age have a short lifespan, measured in hours rather than days. Once something is known, even by a small group in a locked room, the clock starts ticking toward inevitable disclosure. The king understood this reality all too well. In her private sitting room, surrounded by comfortable furniture and muted colors that permitted honest conversation, the queen consort listened as her husband explained everything. She had weathered every imaginable scandal alongside this man. She had endured public hatred, vicious tabloid coverage, and the eternal shadow cast by his first wife. She had stood beside him when polls showed the nation wanted him to abdicate before ever taking the throne, when the world called him unfit for the crown. But this situation was fundamentally different. This wasn't about their relationship or public perception. This was about a man who had lived 50 years without knowing his true identity. She asked about the certainty of the tests. The king explained the verification process in detail, the multiple laboratories, the blind studies, the statistical analysis that left virtually no margin for error, 99.97%. Those numbers eliminated any reasonable doubt. Her hand reached across the space between them, a simple gesture of solidarity forged through decades of facing scrutiny together. Then she asked the question that truly mattered, not what protocol demanded or what the palace advisors would recommend, but what he personally wanted. The king stood and moved to the window, as though the answer might reveal itself somewhere in the darkness beyond the glass. He spoke about wanting to have been present for birthdays and graduations and weddings, about wanting to have watched this son grow, to have been there for all the ordinary moments that define a relationship between father and son. His voice faltered before he could finish the thought. The words hung in the air, weighted with longing for a past that could never be recovered. Meanwhile, across London, in a converted warehouse in Shoreditch, the architect sat at his drafting table, completely unable to work. The DNA results had arrived that afternoon, official and certified, and impossible to dismiss any longer. He told his wife that his entire life felt like a building constructed on a faulty foundation. Everything he had believed about himself, about where he came from, had been based on a lie his mother had maintained for 5 decades. His wife tried to offer comfort, explaining that the DNA results didn't change who he fundamentally was as a person, but he countered that it absolutely changed who he could have been. That distinction mattered more than he could properly articulate. He wasn't angry yet. That emotion would come later, arriving in unpredictable waves that were difficult to manage. In this immediate moment, he simply felt unmoored from reality. His mother had loved him, he knew that with certainty. The man he had called father had been decent, if emotionally distant. He'd had a good childhood by most measures, but somewhere in the world, there had been another father, a biological parent who didn't know he existed, a man who happened to be the King of England. The private secretary had managed royal crises before: deaths, abdication threats, scandals that threatened the very foundation of the monarchy. He approached each situation with calculated precision and careful strategy. But this required something beyond standard damage control. This required deciding what truth meant in the context of a constitutional monarchy and how to navigate the collision between institutional needs and human reality. Using secure communication lines, he issued instructions for a comprehensive investigation. They needed to know everything about this man: his employment history, financial records, medical background, political affiliations, religious views. Most importantly, they needed to know who else might be aware of this information. The investigation moved quietly through channels designed for exactly this kind of sensitive inquiry. Intelligence services were informed, not as a security matter, but as an information-gathering exercise. What they discovered about the architect was unremarkable in the best possible way. He had built a successful career in sustainable architecture. He had been married for 26 years to the same woman. He had 3 children, all of whom were thriving in their own lives. There was no criminal record, no radical political associations, no vulnerabilities that tabloids could exploit. By all accounts, the architect was exactly what the crown would need him to be if this became public: a decent person living a good life. But decency doesn't simplify royal scandals. In some ways, it complicates them significantly. A problematic illegitimate son could be dismissed, potentially paid off, kept at a distance. A fundamentally good man who had just discovered the truth about his parentage couldn't be managed through traditional means. He could only be engaged with as a human being deserving of honesty and respect. In a palace conference room, they gathered to discuss options. The private secretary laid out the limited paths available. They could reach out privately, arrange a meeting, and attempt to bring the architect into some form of understanding with the family. Or they could wait and prepare for when he inevitably went public with the information. The assumption that publicity was inevitable dominated the discussion. People talk. The architect's wife knew. Perhaps his children knew by now. Laboratory staff had signed confidentiality agreements, but those documents weren't impenetrable barriers. Someone would talk eventually. Someone always did. The Queen Consort offered an alternative that struck the room into silence. Simply acknowledge that the architect was the king's son, and deal with whatever consequences followed. The radical simplicity of just telling the truth. But acknowledgement meant far more than private acceptance. It meant public declaration, rewriting official histories, explaining why a 50-year-old man was only now being recognized. It meant addressing questions about succession, about titles, about the carefully maintained narrative of royal propriety that the institution depended upon. The king made his decision. He wanted to meet the architect first, before anything else happened. The man deserved that much, at minimum. A message was sent through Dr. Ashworth, carefully worded to sound like an invitation rather than a royal summons. Would the architect be willing to meet privately with His Majesty to discuss the recent medical findings? The response came within an hour, simple and direct. Yes, they scheduled the meeting for Thursday, just 2 days away. 48 hours for a king to consider what you say to the son you never knew existed. 48 hours for an architect to prepare for meeting the biological father who had been absent his entire life. The location would be the king's private estate in the Cotswolds, his personal sanctuary where he could be most himself. Stripped of as much formality as his position would ever allow, the world continued completely unaware. Newspapers reported on state visits and parliamentary debates and celebrity gossip. Life proceeded as though nothing fundamental had shifted in the fabric of reality. But in 2 days, in gardens that the king had cultivated with his own hands over decades, two men connected by biology but separated by 50 years of ignorance would sit across from each other and try to find language for something that had no precedent. Thursday arrived with perfect English weather that felt almost deliberately staged. Clear skies, gentle warmth, the private estate's gardens displaying everything the king had invested in them over the years. The careful attention, the patience, the belief that growth requires time and proper tending. He had barely slept the night before. The queen consort had stayed with him through the dark hours, not offering solutions because there weren't any to offer, just providing presence in the face of an impossible situation. In the morning, the king dressed in casual clothing, something he rarely permitted himself. He checked his reflection not from vanity, but from a need to see himself as his son might see him for the first time. He wondered aloud what would happen if the architect hated him. The queen consort offered an equally possible alternative scenario. What if he didn't? The question hung between them, neither answer offering more comfort than the other. A car approached through the grounds. Security, minimal and discreet. Inside sat the architect, wearing a suit, because what else do you wear to meet your biological father who happens to be king? He had told his wife that morning that he felt like he was attending his own trial. She had held him close and offered wisdom that cut through his anxiety. Neither of them was on trial. They were just two men trying to understand an impossible truth. The car stopped. The architect stepped out and simply stood there for a long moment, looking at the house and gardens, taking in the life he had never been part of. From an upstairs window, the king watched. The moment of recognition hit him with physical force, seeing himself reflected in another person's face, in their movements, in the angle of their jaw, genetic echoes across 5 decades. The architect carried himself with quiet confidence that reminded the king of his own father. Biology asserted itself in ways that transcended environment or upbringing. They met in the drawing room, a space formal enough to provide structure, but informal enough to permit genuine human interaction. A tea service had been arranged because the English instinctively turned to tea in moments of crisis or discomfort. The two men faced each other across a distance measured not just in feet but in 50 years of absence, 50 years of a relationship that should have existed but never had the chance to develop. The king thanked the architect for coming and acknowledged the unprecedented nature of their situation. The architect agreed simply that there was indeed no handbook for this moment. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something vast, gathering courage to step forward into unknown territory. They sat. The king poured tea with hands that shook slightly despite his best efforts at composure. The architect accepted the cup, equally unsteady. The formality provided a shield they both needed in those first vulnerable moments. The king spoke first about what mattered most. He hadn't known. He needed the architect to understand that absolutely and without question. The mother had never told him about the pregnancy or the child. If she had, everything would have been different. The architect responded that he believed this. He had spent 5 days thinking about almost nothing else, weighing whether this was a case of abandonment or genuine ignorance. He had concluded it was ignorance, and that belief allowed him to sit in this room without anger poisoning any possibility of connection. Relief washed visibly across the king's face. The architect then asked why his mother had never told the truth, why she had carried this secret for more than 50 years. The king offered his theory. She had been protecting them both, protecting him from a scandal that would have destroyed his position before he ever reached the throne, protecting her son from a life of scrutiny and public examination that he had never asked for. But the architect pointed out the cost of that protection, a lifetime of not knowing who he truly was. The words landed between them with considerable weight. The conversation shifted towards safer ground. The king asked about the architect's work. When he learned about the focus on sustainable design, on buildings that work with their environment rather than against it, a small smile appeared on his face. The king had spent 30 years arguing for exactly that approach, driving colleagues and officials mad with his environmental advocacy. The architect admitted he had read those speeches over the years and agreed with most of the positions taken. Common ground, unexpected and genuine, began to form between them. They talked for 3 hours, moving from professional interests to family to philosophy. The architect spoke of his children with obvious pride. The king spoke of his sons and the complexities of raising them in the public eye. They discussed the woman who had kept the secret, whom the architect described with a love that made the king ache for never having properly known her beyond those 4 months decades ago. They talked about duty and legacy and the weight of names that define lives before those lives have even begun. The king showed the architect his gardens, walking him through the organic principles and rewilding projects, the careful balance between intervention and letting nature lead. The architect understood it professionally, but also on a deeper level. The need to build things that last, that matter, that serve something beyond personal ego or ambition. They stopped by a wildflower meadow the king had planted himself over several years. The architect explained that his children didn't know yet about their royal grandfather. He had needed to meet the king first, to understand what this meant, before changing his family's entire understanding of themselves. The king asked what the architect would tell them. The response was simple: the truth, that their grandfather was the king. That biology is strange and complicated, and sometimes surfaces decades later. That their grandmother kept a secret that probably saved multiple lives from being destroyed by scandal. Standing there in the meadow, surrounded by flowers the king had planted with his own hands, the royal composure finally cracked. He had been trained since birth to contain emotion, to present a certain controlled face regardless of internal reality. But training has limits. Tears began to fall. He spoke of having missed everything, of not having been there for any of the important moments in his son's life. The architect's response was both simple and profound. No, the king hadn't been there before, but he was here now. The two men stood together in that moment, not embracing because it was too soon and too uncertain, but present in a way that mattered. A beginning, however fragile and complicated it might be. They returned to the house as afternoon faded into evening. They made tentative plans for another meeting, this time including their families. They agreed that public acknowledgement would come eventually but didn't need to happen immediately. Both needed time to process what was unfolding. The institution would have to adjust to this new reality in its own time. As the architect's car pulled away, the king stood in the drive watching until it disappeared around the bend in the road. The queen consort emerged from the house and took his hand. He told her he had a son he would never truly know in the way fathers should know their children. And that son had a father who could never give him back the years that mattered most. But it was something. It was real. That would have to be enough. The next morning, the king woke with a clarity he had lacked for days. He contacted the private secretary with specific instructions. Begin preparing a statement for eventual release. And more importantly, reach out to his other sons. They needed to hear this news from their father directly, not from tabloids or palace sources. The truth was going to surface eventually. The only question was whether they could control how that happened, or whether chaos would dictate the terms. Telling your sons that they have a half-brother they never knew existed requires a different kind of courage than facing the public or navigating a constitutional crisis. This was a deeply personal, intimate family complication that didn't care about titles or protocols. The king asked to meet with his elder son first, then the younger one separately. They had always processed difficult information differently. One with careful methodical analysis, the other with immediate emotional response. Early that evening, the heir arrived with his face set in the careful neutrality he had perfected over years of public life. They met in a private office, the space between them filled with decades of unspoken history. His late mother, questions of duty, the slow reconciliation of vastly different approaches to the same impossible job. The king began by saying there was no easy way to share what needed to be shared. The heir's instant response revealed his first fear. Was someone dying? The king assured him it was nothing like that, but it was deeply complicated. The king laid out the facts methodically. The affair in the early 1970s, the pregnancy was kept secret. The woman's silence was maintained for 5 decades. The architect's life lived in complete ignorance of his true parentage. The DNA results proved everything beyond any reasonable doubt. He watched his son absorb information that fundamentally rewrote their family history and complicated questions of succession. The heir's face progressed from confusion to comprehension to something unreadable. After a long silence, the heir asked whether his brother knew yet. The king explained he was telling the heir first, respecting his position as next in line to the throne. Then came the question that truly cut to the heart of things. Did their mother know about this? The ghost that haunted every royal family discussion. The king explained that no, this had happened long before her, before he had even met her. But the heir, who had inherited his mother's instinct for emotional truth, observed that she would have hated this revelation. The deception, the secret child. She had been shaped and wounded by royal dishonesty. This secret, even though it predated her, would have felt like confirmation of everything she had suspected about the institution's capacity for compartmentalization and concealment. The heir began processing the information with the careful weighing of options he had learned from birth. He asked what the architect was like as a person. The king described him as decent and thoughtful, an architect working in sustainable design, married with 3 children, a man who had lived a good life outside the machinery of royalty. The heir made an observation tinged with recognition rather than bitterness. Their half-brother had been protected from all the weight and scrutiny that came with their position. There was a certain irony in that. He had spent his entire life inside the machinery of the monarchy. The architect had spent his time outside it. Both paths had their costs and their advantages. The king said he would like the heir to meet the architect when everyone felt ready, along with wives and children. He called the architect family. The heir questioned whether biology alone made someone family, arguing that family was built through shared experience and time. The king agreed, but added that family was also not less than genetics. The conversation ended without full resolution, but with an agreement to move forward carefully. Later that evening, the king met with his younger son at a different residence. The dynamic was immediately different, looser, and more volatile. A relationship still mending from years of rupture and distance. The younger prince arrived wearing the defensive armor he had developed after years of being scrutinized and misunderstood, eventually driven to distance himself from the institution entirely. The king told the same story. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Another family secret, another thing nobody thought to mention until it exploded into a crisis. The king insisted he genuinely hadn't known about the architect's existence. But the prince was pacing now, arguing that someone must have known. Palace staff, whose job was to manage exactly these kinds of situations. And they had buried it, hidden it away. This was his perpetual struggle, the institutional machinery that protected itself at the expense of individuals. He had watched it consume his mother, then later his own wife. Every new secret confirmed his worldview about the palace's priorities. The king explained his genuine belief that no one had known, not even the late queen. This had been buried by one woman trying to protect everyone involved. The younger prince demanded to know what came next. Would they acknowledge the architect publicly? Give him a title? Pretend 50 years of absence didn't matter? The king said they would acknowledge the truth and then try to build something genuine from there. That was all anyone could realistically do. The prince stopped pacing and looked at his father with the perpetual tension that defined their relationship, wanting to believe in growth and change while remembering decades of disappointment. He said he wanted to meet the architect, but not for a staged photo opportunity or palace-managed introduction. He wanted to actually meet him, to see if he was worth the effort of protecting. The king clarified that the architect wasn't seeking protection or publicity. He was simply trying to understand his own life after 5 decades of false information. The prince's expression softened slightly at this, recognizing a shared experience. Both men had been profoundly shaped by mothers who held painful secrets they felt necessary to keep. The conversations continued over several days. The heir's wife met with the king and listened with the practical intelligence that had made her an unexpected stabilizing force in the family. She asked detailed questions about the architect's wife and children, about the life implications of sudden royal connection. Her approach was neither judgmental nor overly sentimental, simply focused on understanding the human dimension of what was unfolding. A family dinner was arranged at the castle as an attempt at normalcy, while nothing felt remotely normal. Then it happened. At 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, the story broke, not through official palace channels or carefully managed statements, but through a leak. Someone at the laboratory, or perhaps a friend of the architect's family, or simply someone who had overheard something and couldn't resist the currency of royal scandal. The headlines spread like wildfire across digital platforms and news outlets. Secret royal son. DNA proves the king has a hidden heir. By 7 in the morning, every major outlet had picked up the story. By 8, the architect's home was surrounded by cameras and reporters shouting questions. By 9, the palace was in full crisis mode, with emergency meetings convened. The private secretary, communications team, and palace lawyers gathered with the controlled panic of an institution under siege. They had two fundamental options available: deny the story and launch an investigation into the leak, or confirm the truth and attempt to control the narrative. Given that the DNA evidence was legitimate and already circulating publicly, denial would only make everything exponentially worse. They needed an official statement within the hour. The longer they remained silent, the more the narrative would spiral beyond any possibility of management. But the king wasn't at the palace. He had retreated to his country estate to think and prepare for what he had known was inevitable. The queen consort sat with him as they both read the coverage on screens that felt invasive even in their own private space. The king's first thought wasn't for himself or the institution. He spoke about needing to protect the architect from what was about to engulf his entire life. At the architect's home across London, security personnel attempted to hold back the press that had materialized seemingly overnight. His wife worked to shield their children from the chaos erupting just outside their front door. The media circus intensified by the hour. Reporters speculated wildly about every aspect of the story. Royal experts appeared on television analyzing every possible angle. The public divided sharply between fascination and fury. Some defended the king, arguing it was a private matter from decades ago that harmed no one. Others attacked him for secrecy, for alleged abandonment, for adding another layer to the complicated and often troubling legacy of royal propriety. The architect became an instant celebrity against his will. Photographers compared his facial features to the king's in detailed side-by-side analyses published across newspapers and websites. Articles dissected his career, his family, his entire life history, searching desperately for anything scandalous or particularly noteworthy. They found nothing of substance. The architect was, frustratingly for tabloids seeking drama, exactly what the initial palace investigation had shown: a fundamentally good man living a good life with no buried scandals to excavate. The statement was released on official palace letterhead using carefully measured language. It confirmed the DNA test results. It acknowledged that the king had been completely unaware of the architect's existence until very recently. It expressed His Majesty's sincere wish to build a private relationship with the architect and his family. It requested that media outlets respect their privacy during this sensitive time. That final request was optimistic to the point of being naive. The architect watched the statement being read on television news. Something visibly broke in his expression. Not anger exactly, but deep exhaustion. He observed to his wife that the king was protecting the institution first. He understood it on an intellectual level, but the statement was so carefully worded and diplomatic, it said nothing authentically real, nothing that captured the actual human dimension of what they were both experiencing. The phone rang, an unknown number. The architect almost didn't answer, exhausted by journalists and curiosity seekers. Then he decided to pick up. The king's voice came through, unsteady and unmistakably genuine. He apologized for how the architect was experiencing all of this. The architect responded with painful honesty. One of them was the king, the other an architect now reduced to a sensational headline. They existed in fundamentally different universes with different rules governing their lives. Days passed. Media coverage shifted in specific focus but didn't disappear or diminish significantly. The architect's life was irrevocably changed. He was recognized everywhere now. Privacy had been completely obliterated. His children were dealing with sudden, unwanted fame. Photographers followed them to school. The life the architect had carefully built through decades of work was being picked apart by people who had never met him and never would. A week later, they arranged another meeting at a private estate in Scotland. Minimal staff, no press access, just the king, the architect, and the conversation they needed to have. The king spoke first, admitting he didn't know how to be the architect's father after 50 years of absence. The architect responded with equal honesty. He didn't know how to be the king's son. He had already had a father, deceased 6 years now, whom he still misses. The relationship they might have had was impossible to retrieve. The question was what they could realistically build instead. They agreed to try, not to be father and son in the traditional sense, but to be something else. Two people, related by blood, who genuinely wanted to understand each other. No formal titles between them when they were alone. No institution mediating every single interaction. Weeks later, a private garden party took place at the estate. The king and queen consort, the heir with his wife and the royal children, the architect with his wife and their children. Everyone was slightly uncomfortable at first, but present and willing to make the effort. The children found common ground easily. The adults watched, grateful for the children's uncomplicated acceptance of this new family configuration. Years passed in brief glimpses. The king sent birthday cards to the architect's children, attended the architect's eldest daughter's wedding, tried in small, consistent ways to be present in a life he had missed the foundation of. They met for dinner several times annually, slowly building something that didn't fit traditional categories but was real nonetheless. The king, in his private moments, allowed Inspector himself to feel genuine regret. Not for the affair itself, but for the years lost, for the child who grew up without him, for the family tree that could have been different if only someone had spoken the truth decades earlier. He had wept when he first read those DNA results, but he had stood back up, faced the architect, faced his family, faced the public, and their judgment. And he was trying, imperfectly and belatedly, but genuinely, to build something real from the fragments of a secret that should never have been kept for 50 years.